June 1944. Somewhere above the clouds of occupied Europe, the sky burns with silver flashes. A P-47 Thunderbolt dives through a swarm of Messerschmitts, metal shrieking, oil pressure dropping. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds watches his gauges scream red. Manifold pressure, too high. RPM, past the limit. He knows what that means. One more minute of power, maybe less. Before the engine tears itself apart, he pushes the throttle anyway. The roar becomes unbearable, like the heart of the plane is tearing open. The German fighter fills his gun sight for a single perfect instant. He squeezes the trigger. A burst of tracers rips through the Messerschmitt's fuselage. Explosion. Smoke. Silence. Reynolds exhales. Alive. Behind him, his engine coughs, sputters, and dies. He's hundreds of miles from home, gliding on luck and fumes. But that day, he learned what many American pilots were discovering. Sometimes, to win the war in the air, you had to destroy your own engine first. By early 1943, the skies over Europe belonged to the Germans. The Luftwaffe's seasoned pilots, men who had fought since Spain and Poland, commanded the air with unmatched precision. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s climbed faster, turned sharper, and ruled the middle altitudes where most dogfights began and ended. The Americans, new to the European theater, arrived with ambition and limitations. Their bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, could carry destruction deep into enemy territory, but their escort fighters couldn't follow them all the way. The P-47 Thunderbolt, though rugged and powerful, was heavy. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine made it nearly indestructible in a dive, but also thirsty. Its range barely carried it to the target and back. When escorting bombers to Germany, many P-47s had to turn home halfway, leaving the bombers exposed, and the P-38 Lightning, fast and elegant, suffered in Europe's cold, high-altitude conditions. Compressors froze. Engines failed. Each loss reminded American commanders that air superiority wasn't about bravery alone. It was about machinery. Meanwhile, German engineers were pushing their aircraft and pilots to perfection. The FW-190's BMW 801 radial engine gave it brutal acceleration and climb. The Me-109's DB-605 inline engine provided efficiency and sustained power. Every American pilot knew, if a Luftwaffe ace got behind you, your margin for error vanished. Then came the reports, stories whispered across airfields. Pilots who had survived impossible odds by doing the unthinkable, pushing the throttle beyond the red line, driving their engines into war emergency power. Officially, every flight manual warned against it. Overboosting could warp pistons, melt valves, or blow entire cylinders. Yet in combat, manuals didn't matter. By mid-1943, those moments of desperation began shaping a new culture among American airmen, one where mechanical caution gave way to sheer instinct. Pilots discovered that if you treated your engine as expendable, you might live long enough to fly another day. At first, commanders resisted. Engineers at Pratt & Whitney, Wright, and Allison sent urgent cables warning against exceeding manifold pressure limits. But field data told another story. Every time a pilot returned from battle with a shot-up airplane and a destroyed engine, his victory count often climbed. The military bureaucracy began to notice. Maybe this wasn't recklessness. Maybe it was adaptation. Engineers went back to their test benches, experimenting with new methods to safely give pilots that extra surge of power. Water methanol injection, boosted fuel mixtures, and emergency settings marked in bold letters. Weep, War Emergency Power. It was a silent pact between man and machine. Use it only when death is closer than home. The idea would soon spread, from Europe's cold altitudes to the blazing skies of the Pacific. But before that, American air power had to learn one more painful truth: that winning a war of machines meant learning how to break them. If stories like this move you, consider subscribing to WW Tales Stories. We'd also love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive back into the story. By late 1943, the air war had become a battle not only of pilots, but of pressures and pistons. Every advantage in altitude, climb rate, or acceleration came down to one thing: engine power. The nation that could squeeze a few more seconds of thrust from its engines could decide the outcome of an entire campaign. American engineers knew it. So did the pilots. In dusty hangars from England to the Pacific, mechanics began making quiet modifications. They'd tweak fuel flow, adjust turbo supercharger settings, and sometimes remove factory restrictors entirely. These changes weren't written in manuals, but they spread from squadron to squadron like folklore. A small brass plate on the throttle quadrant marked WEP, War Emergency Power, became both a promise and a threat. When pilots pushed past that gate, the engine's life expectancy dropped sharply. Oil temperatures soared, cylinders warped. Yet those brief moments, 30 seconds, maybe a minute, could mean the difference between victory and a flaming dive into the sea. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800, the heart of aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the F-6F Hellcat, became the unsung hero of this gamble. Built to endure punishment, it could survive brief bursts far beyond its rated limits. Tests showed that if you cooled it down fast enough afterward, it might even make it home. In Europe, Blåstiprödet Sanonantwordindot, new high-octane fuels arrived. 150-octane blue gas shipped from refineries in the U.S. It allowed engines to handle more compression and boost without immediate detonation. Pilots quickly realized what that meant. They could redline longer, climb faster, and escape situations that once meant certain death. At the same time, the British RAF had already experimented with similar systems, fitting Spitfires with short-term power boosts. American engineers learned from their allies and improved it. They introduced water methanol injection, a simple but brilliant idea. By injecting a mix of water and alcohol into the engine cylinders, it cooled the air-fuel charge and prevented detonation, letting the pilot push the throttle harder without instant failure. Still, every pilot knew the truth. These systems bought power with borrowed time. Overuse meant catastrophic damage. Yet, as combat reports came in, a pattern emerged. Engines destroyed, missions saved, engines replaced, pilots alive. Commanders began to change their tone. At first, engine destruction had meant reprimand. Now, it meant resourcefulness. In training lectures, instructors told new pilots, "Your airplane is a tool. Use every bit of it." At fighter bases in England, bulletin boards began displaying handwritten notes. "Don't bring your engine home if it costs you your life." The Air Force was transforming. The old peacetime caution of machine preservation was giving way to a new wartime doctrine. Fight like your aircraft is already gone. Even manufacturers began adjusting their philosophy. Factories were instructed to build engines faster and replace them sooner. Reliability was redefined, not by how long an engine could last, but by how long it could fight before breaking. And through this shift, something remarkable happened. America's airmen began winning. From escorting bombers over Germany to dogfights above the Pacific, Pilots who had once felt outmatched began to dominate the skies. The numbers told the story, but the truth was simpler. For the first time, the U.S. Air Force had mastered the art of controlled destruction. But what did that look like in the cockpit, when split-second choices decided whether an engine would survive or explode? That story unfolds next. To understand why American pilots destroyed their own engines, you have to step inside that cockpit, into the noise, the vibration, the smell of fuel and cordite. At 25,000 feet, logic fades. Instinct takes over. The men who fought in the skies of Europe and the Pacific weren't reckless. They were calculating survivors. Each decision came down to seconds. Do you stay within the limits, or do you push? Do you trust the manual, or your gut? For many, it wasn't a choice. It was a reflex. They had watched friends vanish in smoke, heard desperate radio calls fade into static. In the chaos of aerial combat, those red lines on the gauges became suggestions, not boundaries. Better to burn the engine than to burn with it, one pilot wrote in his diary after returning from a mission over France. His P-47 cylinders were cracked, oil pressure gone, but he lived. The mechanics would pull the engine, replace it, and he'd fly again the next morning. That was the unspoken rule. Engines were replaceable. Men were not. The training schools didn't teach that. War did. By mid-1944, American pilots had learned to feel their machines like living creatures. They could sense when a piston was about to seize, when the temperature was too high, when the turbo was screaming for mercy. Yet they also knew that a plane at full throttle could climb faster than fear. This wasn't mere bravery. It was discipline born of desperation. A good pilot could balance destruction, push just enough for just long enough. The best could dance with it. They called it riding the edge. Overboost for 20 seconds, throttle back for 10, then push again. Keep the rhythm, keep the sky. Commanders began to notice something else. Pilots who understood this balance, who treated the engine not as fragile but as a weapon, had higher kill ratios. They returned more often. They led others. It was a paradox of courage and control. To survive, they had to destroy carefully. But this mindset came with a cost. Every time a pilot pushed into war emergency power, he knew the odds. A single mistake, a few seconds too long, could tear the propeller from the nose or send the engine into flames. And there were countless stories of those who went too far. Still, the philosophy spread. Young pilots entering combat heard the same advice from veterans. When you see tracers coming at you, shove it forward. Worry about the engine later. And so they did. Over the fields of France, over the islands of the Pacific, over the blue deserts of the sky. Each man became a master of calculated ruin. Pilots who, in the words of one historian, won by breaking what they flew. The story of destroying engines to win battles wasn't just born in cockpits. It was engineered on the ground. While pilots risked everything in the skies, a parallel war raged in the workshops and test facilities of Wright Field, Ohio, and Pratt & Whitney's East Hartford plant. Engineers dissected burned-out engines, studying melted pistons and shattered crankcases like battlefield wounds. Each broken part told a story of survival. One test report from 1944 began with a simple observation. Engine failed after 1.3 minutes at 75 of mercury boost. Pilot returned safely. Failure in this case was success. It meant the engine lasted long enough. From these failures emerged a new philosophy: planned overstress. Factories began designing engines not just for performance, but for sacrifice. They introduced reinforced cylinder heads, stronger bearings, and dual ignition systems capable of tolerating abuse far beyond earlier designs. In essence, the United States began building engines meant to die heroically. To control that sacrifice, engineers refined the war emergency power system. The key was chemistry, water methanol injection. When injected into the supercharger, the liquid cooled the combustion chamber, delaying detonation and preventing premature explosion. This allowed temporary boosts in manifold pressure, from 52 inches to 64, sometimes even 70. The results were astonishing. The same P-47 Thunderbolt that struggled to climb with a Bf-109 could now match its acceleration, even outclimb it, for brief moments. In those moments, lives were saved. Meanwhile, aircraft manuals were quietly rewritten. Earlier editions warned, "Do not exceed manifold pressure limits except under dire emergency." By 1944, the language had changed. War emergency power may be used for up to 5 minutes as conditions require. The shift was subtle, but revolutionary. It acknowledged what pilots were already doing, legitimizing their instinct. Commanders, too, adapted their tactics. Fighter units began incorporating WEP into combat drills. They trained pilots to time their bursts, to feel the limits before failure. It wasn't random anymore. It was a calculated weapon. In Europe, the 8th Air Force used these techniques to escort bombers deep into Germany. P-47s and P-51s could now chase Luftwaffe fighters higher and farther than ever before. Over time, kill ratios began to change. The hunted became the hunters. In the Pacific, the same doctrine spread to the Navy and Marine Corps. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, powered by R-2800 engines, faced nimble Japanese Zeros that still outturned them. But with WEP engaged, the American fighters could climb away or deliver crushing bursts of speed in dives. Pilots learned to burst and brake, use a few seconds of extra thrust to strike, then vanish before the Zero could turn. These tactical evolutions were recorded in after-action reports and combat analyses. They showed that even though engines often came back scorched or ruined, the pilots almost always came back alive. It became part of the unspoken code. If your engine wasn't smoking at the end of a fight, maybe you hadn't fought hard enough. This mindset redefined aerial warfare. For the first time, maintenance crews were told to expect destruction and be ready for it. Engines were treated like ammunition, expended, replaced, forgotten. One senior engineer described it bluntly in a 1945 memo. "We are not building peacetime engines. We are building weapons that must burn bright and brief." That philosophy, efficiency through expendability, would echo far beyond the war. It would shape the birth of the jet age, where engines were designed to deliver extreme power for limited durations rather than endurance. The lesson was clear. The limits of a machine were not absolute. They were defined by the courage of those willing to cross them. By the spring of 1944, the war in the skies over Europe had reached its breaking point. The Allies were preparing for D-Day. The Luftwaffe, though bleeding, was still lethal, and the U.S. 8th Air Force needed one thing above all: control of the air. Every day, streams of silver bombers crossed into German territory. Hundreds of B-17s and B-24s, flying in tight formations that glittered like metal cities in the sun. Behind them came their guardians, P-47, Thunderbolts, and P-51, Mustangs, tasked with clearing the skies of enemy fighters. But on the other side waited the Jagdgeschwader, veteran Luftwaffe fighter, wings whose experience outmatched almost anything the Americans could field. They knew the routes, the altitudes, the timing, and above 25,000 feet, their Bf-109Gs and FW-190As still climbed faster. For U.S. pilots, it was a cruel equation. If they followed procedure, they died. so they stopped following it. Operation Argument, February 1944. The Americans called it Big Week. For 7 days, U.S. bombers hammered the German aircraft industry. Regensburg, Leipzig, Augsburg, all defended by some of the best pilots in the world. It was during these raids that the phenomenon of war emergency power became legend. In one engagement, a group of 56th Fighter Group P-47s encountered nearly 30 German fighters climbing head-on. The Thunderbolts were slower in ascent, doomed if they couldn't gain altitude. Their leader, Colonel Hubert Zemke, gave the order. Kick it in! Every pilot rammed the throttle past the stop. Boost pressures soared past safe limits. Engines screamed like tortured metal. But the formation surged upward, clawing through the thin air. Within seconds, the P-47s had the altitude advantage, a miracle for an aircraft often mocked as the flying milk bottle. The dogfight that followed was chaos. Tracers tore through contrails, engines belched smoke, but by the end, the Thunderbolts claimed more than a dozen kills, and not one pilot lost. When they landed, ground crews reported half the engines were wrecked. Burnt valves, split gaskets, warped turbine blades, but Zemke's answer was simple. Engines are cheaper than men. A few months later, the newly arrived P-51 Mustang, powered by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin, took the concept even further. Its pilots discovered that with the new 150-octane fuel, the Merlin could safely hold 72 inches of boost, far above the standard limit. At 11,000 feet over Berlin, Mustang squadrons proved it. One after-action report told of Captain Don Gentile flying with the 4th Fighter Group, who chased a Focke-Wulf through cloud layers at full emergency boost for nearly a minute. His manifold pressure was beyond red. His coolant temperature maxed out. The German tried to dive, but Gentile's Mustang held, closing the gap with impossible speed. A short burst, and the Focke-Wulf disintegrated. Gentile throttled back just in time. The Merlin coughed, sputtered, and barely held together for the flight home. On the ground, mechanics found hairline cracks in 3 pistons. The engine would never fly again. But Gentile's victory made headlines. The message spread across every squadron. If the fight demands it, push it past the limit. By June 1944, that attitude had become doctrine. Fighter briefings for D-Day escorts openly discussed emergency climb power and maximum burst acceleration. No longer taboo, it was expected. German intelligence even noted the shift. In one intercepted Luftwaffe report, a squadron leader wrote, "The Americans now press their engines beyond regulation. Their speed in ascent is greatly increased, though their motors often fail afterward." It was the sign of a turning tide. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots faced an enemy that could not only match their skill, but their willingness to destroy their own machines in pursuit of victory. In the summer skies over France, hundreds of American engines burned out. But the bombers they protected reached their targets. The price was high, but the strategy was working. By mid-1944, the overboosted roar of Allied engines had become the sound of liberation itself. But halfway around the world, another front awaited, and another set of pilots would learn the same brutal lesson over the vast Pacific. The Pacific was a different kind of battlefield. Endless horizons, brutal humidity, and enemies who seemed to appear from nowhere. Here, the air war wasn't fought over cities or factories. It was fought over waves and islands, the thin line between sky and sea. And while Europe's Luftwaffe had its aces and discipline, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had something else. The Mitsubishi A6M-0. Light, agile, almost mystical in its maneuverability. For American pilots, the first encounters in 1942 had been devastating. Zeros turned inside every attack. They climbed faster. They seemed to dance on air. By 1943, the Americans had newer, tougher aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair, both powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. But against the Zero, power alone wasn't enough. Not unless a pilot was willing to push that power past safety. June 19, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Morning sun blazed across hundreds of contrails as waves of Japanese aircraft dived toward the U.S. Carrier Task Force. The Hellcats, a VF-16, launched from USS Lexington, climbed to intercept. Lieutenant Alex Vratsiu, a calm but deadly marksman, spotted a formation of dive bombers descending through the haze. He jammed the throttle full forward and then pushed harder. The engine's roar deepened to a violent growl. Manifold pressure climbed beyond the red arc. Oil temperature spiked. The entire aircraft trembled. But the Hellcat surged upward like a beast unleashed. Within seconds, Vratsiu tore into the Japanese formation, his 650 caliber guns shredding aircraft in rapid succession. 6 kills in 8 minutes. By the time he returned to his carrier, his engine was smoking heavily. Mechanics said it was ruined. Vratsiu just grinned. It gave me everything it had. That battle would later be called the Marianas Turkey. Shoot! But beneath the statistics and headlines lay a truth that mechanics understood better than anyone. Those victories were paid for in engines sacrificed to heat and stress. Farther south, on the scattered islands of the Solomons and the Philippines, Marine Corsair squadrons fought from rough coral airstrips where maintenance was a luxury. They faced Japanese raids daily, and they learned fast that the only way to survive a surprise attack was to climb instantly. Pilots called it the vertical gamble. When the sirens wailed, they'd shove the throttle forward past the detent, feel the kick as the water injection activated, and pray the engine held. At 64 inches of manifold pressure, the R-2800 cylinders glowed cherry red. But the Corsair, that brutal bent-wing fighter, would leap off the strip like a shell from a gun. Captain Kenneth Walsh, one of the top Marine aces, described it later. You didn't think about saving the engine. You thought about saving your squadron. Many of those engines never flew again, but their sacrifice bought dominance over the Pacific skies. By late 1944, war emergency power wasn't a secret anymore. It was a standard feature. Carrier flight decks displayed new checklists. WEP available, 5 Mayan max. Engineers even modified gauges with black and yellow stripes beyond the red line, a visual reminder that this power was both salvation and suicide. Instructors taught new pilots how to use it wisely. Don't hold it, they said. Touch it and back off. Yet in the heat of combat, wisdom often vanished. At Okinawa, as kamikaze waves approached the fleet, Hellcats and Corsairs launched with throttles already past the gate. The roar of hundreds of overboosted engines filled the air, a mechanical scream that could be heard across the sea. Engines cracked, bearings failed, but the skies stayed clear. For those few months, America's fighters achieved near-total air supremacy in the Pacific, not because their planes were flawless, but because their pilots were willing to break them to keep others alive. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the lesson was carved into aviation history. Sometimes, the measure of an engine wasn't how long it lasted, but how long it could fight before breaking. In every burned piston and warped cylinder lay the record of a pilot who refused to yield. But wars don't end when the engines stop. What came next would reshape how nations built machines and how they measured courage. The summer of 1945 brought silence. Engines that had screamed across two oceans now sat cold and oil-stained, lined up on airfields that stretched to the horizon. The war was over, and for the first time in years, there was time to listen to the hum of peace. But in that silence, a new kind of reckoning began. When engineers at Pratt & Whitney, Allison, and Wright Aeronautical began examining the thousands of returned engines, what they found astonished them. Many were far beyond any pre-war endurance limit. Cylinders warped like petals, piston rings fused to metal, crankshafts blew from heat. Engines that should have failed within minutes had held together through missions lasting hours. One test engineer wrote in his report, "The field data exceeds all laboratory projections. It seems we underestimated not the machines, but the men who flew them." They realized something profound. Under combat stress, engines could endure far more than their theoretical limits. The conservative safety margins of peacetime design had been shattered by wartime necessity. This discovery changed aviation forever. Before the war, aircraft design was governed by longevity. An engine's worth was measured in hours. How long it could run before overhaul. After the war, that definition shifted. Engineers began asking a new question. How much power can it produce before it breaks? And can it survive just long enough? The War Emergency Power Doctrine had proven that engines could be trusted to deliver extraordinary performance for short bursts. This idea directly influenced the emerging jet age, where power-to-weight ratio replaced mechanical endurance as the ultimate measure of success. When General Electric and Rolls-Royce began developing early turbojets, they adopted wartime logic. Engines would no longer be built to last hundreds of hours. They'd be built to achieve victory in minutes. As one designer put it, "The piston engine taught us that perfection is not longevity. It's precision in destruction." Among pilots, the lessons ran deeper. In post-war interviews and memoirs, many described the feeling of trusting a dying engine. The act of pushing past the red line had become almost spiritual, a merging of man and machine, courage and calculation. Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, the same pilot from the skies over France, later said in an oral history project, "When that needle went past red, I knew two things. I might die, or I might live. But I'd never fly safer than that moment." That mindset, the willingness to gamble everything for a fleeting advantage, became both admired and feared in aviation culture. It gave rise to the test pilot era of the late 1940s, when men like Chuck Yeager and Scott Crossfield would push new jet engines to the edge of destruction, trusting them to hold a little longer than physics said they should. The line between combat and experimentation blurred. The same courage that had driven a P-47 pilot to overboost his radial engine now drove jet pilots past the sound barrier. The U.S. Army Air Forces, soon to become the U.S. Air Force, codified these lessons into doctrine. Training manuals after 1945 included explicit language about emergency power and stress testing. The once taboo practice of exceeding limits was now understood as part of combat discipline, a skill to be managed, not avoided, but with this acceptance came responsibility. Commanders warned that in peacetime, restraint must return. Overstress was a weapon of desperation, not a habit. Still, they knew the truth. When the next war came, those red lines would once again blur. Factories, too, changed. Wartime experience had taught production lines to treat engines as expendable tools. Post-war aviation kept that pragmatism. Airlines, air forces, and manufacturers all adopted a mindset of planned maintenance and rapid replacement. A legacy of those days when a destroyed engine meant a pilot survived. The war had ended, but its mechanical philosophy endured. Yet beneath the triumph of innovation lay something quieter: the human cost of courage, the memory of pilots who pushed too far, and engines that failed before the victory came. Those stories deserve their own silence and their own place in history. When peace finally settled across the Pacific and Europe, the world's skies changed overnight. The endless roar of piston engines faded into memory. Hangars once filled with fighters now held silence, dust, and ghosts. For many pilots, that silence was unbearable. They had spent years living at full throttle, hearts and engines beating in sync, always one moment from destruction. Now, standing on calm airfields, they felt the strange emptiness of survival. Those who had pushed their aircraft past the IE limit often spoke of the same paradox. They had survived because they'd learned to break what they loved. Mechanics, too, remembered. At bases like Duxford, Iwo Jima, and Ishima, they watched pilots taxi in with engines coughing, hissing steam, leaking oil. Many times, those machines never flew again. And yet, ground crews treated each ruined engine like a hero brought home from battle, proof that their work had saved lives. Some kept fragments, melted piston rings, fractured valves, burned spark plugs, relics of a war fought not just with courage, but with calculated self-destruction. To them, these weren't failures. They were victories. The lessons became doctrine. War emergency power didn't die with the piston age. It evolved. Jet engines inherited its principle through afterburners, controlled bursts of overdrive that devoured fuel for short-lived power. It was the same logic: reborn, sacrifice longevity, gain survival. Aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, the F-100 Super Sabre, and the MiG-15 all trace their DNA back to those piston fighters whose pilots had dared to burn hotter than the manuals allowed. Even the space race carried that same spirit. When test pilots strapped into rocket-powered planes like the Bell X-1, they were chasing limits with the same heartbeat as those who once pushed a Thunderbolt's throttle into the red. History had changed its machines, but not its men. Historians later called it the doctrine of expendable endurance. It embodied the brutal pragmatism of total war, that in the face of annihilation, endurance becomes a privilege, not a rule. But there was something profoundly human hidden in that paradox. Destroying one's machine for a few seconds of life was not madness. It was courage under the purest form of pressure. These pilots weren't trying to defy their aircraft. They were asking them to give everything. And the machines did. From those moments came a quiet respect. Between man and metal, life and risk, destruction and victory. In museums today, engines from that era sit behind glass, labeled, restored, silent. But the truth of their story isn't in their steel. It's in the invisible seconds they gave. The ones that decided whether a young man saw another sunrise. Decades later, many surviving pilots reflected on those choices with mixed emotion. Some felt pride that their instincts had helped end the war sooner. Others felt sorrow for the comrades who pushed too far. But nearly all shared a single belief: that courage was never about ignoring fear or pain or danger. It was about using them. Lieutenant Reynolds, now an old man by the 1980s, once said in a rare interview, "The engine didn't die for nothing," or "It bought me a sky." That phrase captured an entire generation's ethos, one built on the fragile line between control and chaos, destruction and deliverance. As the world moved forward, technology advanced, wars changed, and the roar of propellers gave way to the scream of jets. But that wartime lesson remained etched in aviation's DNA. Power always comes at a cost. And sometimes, the greatest victories are born from the willingness to pay it. The war ended 8 decades ago, yet the skies of that era still whisper, not in sound, but in spirit. Every burned engine, every cracked cylinder, every scorched cockpit told the same truth. Victory often demands that we give more than we're built to endure. For the U.S. pilots of World War II, that truth was mechanical and human at once. They learned that courage wasn't a clean or careful thing. It was a controlled surrender to risk. To live, they had to destroy the very machines that carried them. To win, they had to push beyond what engineers and manuals declared possible. It was more than strategy. It was faith. Faith that the engine would hold, that a few seconds of defiance could rewrite fate. That lesson transcended the battlefield. It shaped every generation of aviators that followed, from the first jet. Test pilots to astronauts who rode controlled explosions into the sky. They all carried the same unspoken inheritance. When everything matters, push past the red line. But there's a quieter meaning, too. Those pilots taught us something universal, that limits are not fixed. They are felt, tested, and sometimes broken for something greater than ourselves. Their story isn't about machines. It's about the human will to reach higher, even when the cost is everything below. The roar of those engines is gone now, swallowed by time. Yet in the silence above the clouds, you can almost still hear it, that thin, defiant hum of men and machines who refused to stop when the world told them to. The ocean remembers everything, and so do we. Subscribe to WW Tales Stories and join us as we uncover more untold moments of courage and loss from the Second World War. What part of this story struck you most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to read your take.